Hello, everyone. It is that time. If everyone could find their seat, please. Thank you. We have a very packed evening for you, so we want to start right on time so we can get plenty of time. My name is Elena Brokaw. I am the thank you. I am the executive director of the Museum of Ventura County, and I am delighted to be here tonight to really shine a light on Ivor Davis in this very special Up Close and Personal with Ivor Davis. Before we get to the man himself, there are a couple of VIPs. I know I've missed some of you. I did my best. But I do want to say, slinking right down there at the edge of the auditorium is our District Attorney, Eric Nasarenko. And his Chief Investigator, Scott Whitney. So, you know, the cops are in the house, everybody. And also, I want to say with us is one of my bosses, a member of the board of directors, Jim Scanlon, right back here. So before we get started, I want to give a little plug for the museum. Some of you know the Museum of Ventura County is a nonprofit organization. We depend on charitable contributions to be able to do events like these. We hope that if you enjoy this program, you will consider supporting the museum to make other programs like this possible. And just one very easy way you can do that is by becoming a member. And you can do that at our membership table right here after the event. A membership is fully tax deductible, and then you get free admission to our galleries, free entry to events like this, store discounts, special invitations, and just a huge plethora of other things. So we hope you will consider joining us today with that. All right, so enough about that. We are really here to talk about Ivor. Ivor Davis is nothing short of a living legend. I think you all know that. He traveled with the Beatles. He was in the kitchen when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. He has seen remarkable things, and then he has written them down and turned them into stories so that all of us can experience those things through him. We are honored to be able to have him here to talk about his new book, The Devil in My Friend, which is a great read, and we have copies for sale here. Usually in this program, Ivor is the interviewer, but tonight he is the one who's going to be interrogated first, and then all of you will have a chance to ask your own questions during a Q&A before the book signing. So, Ivor, could you please come on up here? Now, Ivor is going to be interrogated tonight by Paul Bishop. Paul Bishop is very impressive. I'm a little intimidated. He is a novelist, screenwriter, and television personality. He's a nationally recognized interrogator and behaviorist. He had a 35-year career with the LAPD, including 25 years specializing in the investigation of sexual assaults, for which he was twice honored as LAPD's Detective of the Year. He has written numerous scripts for film and television and is the author of 15 novels, 3 nonfiction Western reference works, and then a whole bunch of other things. I don't know. I ran out of time to talk about it. So please, Paul, come on up.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out to support Ivor tonight. A few weeks ago, actually a couple of months ago, I've known Ivor for a lot of years, and a couple of months ago we were having lunch together, and over a few too many Diet Cokes, we came up with this idea of doing this interrogation scenario, and now here we are. So we're going to do this. We just want to do something that was a little bit different than a regular Q&A, and maybe catch your interest in another way, especially since Ivor's new book, The Devil in My Friend, is a nonfiction true crime book. So we figured we'd take advantage of that and do this somewhat differently. So we will start out probably in an interrogation mode. At some point we will kind of drop that and get back into some other questions, and hopefully you'll have your questions. We'll leave plenty of time for that at the end. As was said, my background is in interrogation. It's something I've been doing my entire career. I now teach interrogation to Ventura County sheriffs and to LAPD and various other law enforcement agencies around the country. So this is what I do day in and day out. Now, there are some things that we will be doing tonight that I'll try to explain as we go along, and there are oftentimes things that I wouldn't do, but I'm going to do here, and we'll explain that too. But the first thing you'll notice is when you watch any of the true crime shows like 48 Hours and Dateline and that type of stuff, when the detectives are doing their interrogations of the suspect, they usually sit on one side of the table and the suspect's on the other side of the table. Well, that's when my wife makes me turn the television off because I start throwing shoes at it. Because interrogation is an intimate art. This is something that you have to develop a universe that just contains you and the suspect. So my operating area is in the 2 foot to 0 space, which is very uncomfortable for most people because who do we reserve that for? That's reserved for wives, children, grandma, not the one who pinches your cheek, but the other one, children. And so it immediately establishes that relationship between the suspect and the interrogator, because I've got a very limited time to get this person to tell me the worst things that they've done in their life, right? So we're going to give this a try and see where we go. Oh, the other thing is, at some point, we are not going to reveal for you the final chapters of this book. That's what buying the book means. But I will tell you this about the final chapters of this book. I know the end of the story. I'm well acquainted with the end of this story. And as I'm reading the final chapters of this book, I am literally getting antsy because I'm going, do I really know the end of this story? How is this possible that this is going to turn out the way that I know it turns out? So I think you will find the reading experience of The Devil and My Friend, Murder in Malibu to be a very cathartic experience. And you will get to know intimately a sociopath. Now, people will say to me, what's the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath? For laymen, not much, right? I had explained to me one time that a psychopath is born without certain connections in the brain, and a sociopath is somebody who those connections have been broken at some point. For all intent and purposes, it doesn't matter. We'll use the term sociopath tonight in talking about Fred Rayler, and we will go from there. Okay. So, Mr. Davis, I need you to turn around and face me, please, if you would. Thank you.
Do we have to be this close?
Yes, we do. Normally, when I set the chairs up like this, I leave 18 inches between the back of the suspect's chair and the wall. Because obviously, when I get into this position, what's the natural thing for them to do? Back up, right? Well, if I don't have him back up to the wall, what am I going to do when he does? I'm going to move forward. But if the wall's not there, we end up doing an Indy 500 all around the interrogation room. So can you tell me, Ivor, in your own words, why are you here talking with me this evening?
That's a good question, and I think it has something to do with my friend Fred Rayler, who fooled me. I don't want to spoil the punchline. And do I have to be succinct in my answers, or will you slap me if I don't?
I asked him to wear an orange jumpsuit, but he wouldn't go for it because he said it clashed with his eyes. I need you to tell me in your own words. So I know that, you've made some accusations about Mr. Rayler.
Yes.
And you seem to be very concerned about this. So, in your own words, you're here to tell me about a murder. Is that correct?
I
What
am.
you consider is a murder.
I do.
Right?
Yes.
I'm familiar with these circumstances, and as far as I can see, it's nothing but a tragic event. So I need you to tell me tonight, to convince me, to bring me over to your side as to why this is a murder. So can you start out by laying out the circumstances of when Fred Rayler's second wife and stepson died?
Okay. Basically, I was living in Malibu in the late 70s, and there was a terrible tragedy that occurred. We heard that the wife of my kid's school teacher, that the husband of my kid's school teacher, had an accident and died. And then we heard about this guy, Fred Rayler, whose wife, Jean, also died in tragic circumstances. And you know, your heart opens to that, and you think, oh my God, this is ill fate that has befallen this couple. And guess what? They're getting married. The widow and the widower. Isn't that wonderful?
How long was this after the death of their spouses?
Well, I discovered it was like about 3 months or 4 months or longer, maybe slightly longer, very quickly. But don't forget, you don't have the piece of the puzzle until you have all the pieces. So I thought it was fantastic. And then Fred Rayler came to me and said, you are the coach of the Malibu Lions, a soccer team which had my son Gideon. He said, my son, my stepson, the new son, I'm trying to bond with him. I would like to help you coach. And my heart opened. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? And he did. And he did actually. Oh, I'm going to move in on so we can look at.
Go ahead.
So Fred Rayler, I mean, I thought it was terrific. And he became the soccer coach, my assistant soccer coach. Okay, John.
Oh, okay, there's one.
There we go. So that's the book, by the way.
Okay, but what I want you to do for me.
Okay, so I haven't mentioned it, yeah.
So that I have an understanding of who Fred Rayler is. Before we go any further,
Yes.
I need you to pick him out of an official photo lineup. So I'm going to show you a photo lineup with 6 pictures in it, and I need you to pick Fred out for me.
Okay. Yes. Just a minute. It was a dark night. No. Wait. The guy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is Fred Rayler.
Okay, thank you. So now we see what Fred looks like. Okay. So he comes to you at your soccer team, and he wants to be your assistant coach.
Yeah, and I think it's marvelous because he says he wants to bond. He wants to bond with his son. I mean, whose heart wouldn't melt at that? And to be honest with you, he was terrific. He was dedicated. He came to every single game. He coached his son. At the end of it all, we won the title. And Fred Rayler, I gave Fred Rayler a book about the rules of soccer. But the moment I saw him, I thought, this is a good guy.
Okay. And what was his reputation like in the community?
Well, I mean, he was a very handsome guy. He looked like a hunky movie star. But what I liked about Fred Rayler in those days was he wasn't a bullshit Hollywood guy. He ran around in a beat-up old car. He had those slip-on sandals. But don't forget, Malibu in the 70s and the early 80s was very movie conscious. I mean, the movie stars lived there. Ali MacGraw, Steve McQueen, Larry Hagman, all the stars lived there, and it was a show-off place. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that I left Malibu to come to Ventura, but maybe we'll talk about that another time. This is about down to earth. Anyway, so I thought Fred was a good guy, and a lot of people talked behind his back because his first wife, Jean, who was a gorgeous airline stewardess.
You know, Mr. Davis, I'm going to stop you here. What I really need you to do is to lay out for me the circumstances. We'll get into the details a little later, but lay out for me the circumstances of what you think is a murder and what I think is a tragic event. What happened out by the islands?
So there was Fred Rayler, this great image guy who I thought was a good guy. And what happened was, in New Year's Day, 1980, he went out sailing with his second wife, his stepson, and Fred Rayler's family. And everything seemed to be hunky-dory. And then I picked up the local paper and saw on the front page, terrible tragedy. The wife, number 2, Verna, had died, and Douglas Rayler, her son, Douglas Johnson, her son, had died in this terrible boating accident, literally off the coast of Santa Cruz Island. You can stand at the pier in Ventura and you can see the island on a clear day.
So was this his big yacht that went down, or
No.
tell me about
What
that.
actually happened was he'd gone out on New Year's Day with his family visiting from Indiana. And he decided to go out in a little rubber dinghy to take pictures of bird rock. Now, bird rock is, those of you, you're not supposed to be here at this interrogation, sorry, forget what I just said. Bird rock, you know it's called bird rock because it's a white rock in the middle of the ocean. And I think we're going to say, can you move? Can we take a look at bird rock? Okay, so let's change direction a bit. There's the wedding of Douglas, of Fred Rayler, and that's his son Douglas, his stepson. And he had, in Malibu, I mean, you've got to realize, I thought Fred wasn't a showman, but this was a great wedding with his wife, Verna, and this is their son Douglas. And this was a picturesque wedding that, well, we discovered much later. I don't want to jump ahead of it.
Go back one.
Okay, yes. So there is a picture-perfect picture of the widow, Fred and Verna at their wedding. I mean, what a picturesque thing. And there's young Douglas on the far right. And there's the daughters.
So two of those are his daughters?
Two of those are his daughters, the older ones, and the little one. No, I forget. I mean, two of them are his daughters. One of them is Verna's daughter, and that's Douglas, the boy who died at sea.
And you're telling me that from this perfect family, you think a murder occurs?
Well,
so
if you
let's look at
this,
Bird Rock.
No. If you look at this, no. So here is. There we go. So there's Bird Rock, and that's where the murder took place. I call it murder because I discovered that it was. I hate to spoil the story.
And I'm supposed to believe you at this point?
Well,
Come on.
Yeah, okay.
So continue to tell me about what happens out there.
Okay. So Fred Rayler goes out to this spot here where the arrow is pointing. He goes out with his new wife, his new stepson, and their new family dog, a beagle.
In their dinghy.
In a little rubber dinghy, a kind of dory they call it. I don't know if you know dories. They're kind of round things, 18 feet, and you know,
okay.
the lifeguards use them in Australia a lot. And Fred Rayler says, here's what happened. He said the dog jumped at the seagulls as he was about to take pictures. They had left their parents in Fred's yacht because Fred owned a big yacht. And they'd gone round the corner. And what happened, according to Fred, was the dog jumped out at the birds, the dinghy overturned, and Fred got trapped under this dinghy and couldn't get out. He was trapped by his camera strap, and he couldn't get out. And what happened was, when they all came up, they seemed to be in trouble. Fred bravely put his wife under his arm, he put his son under the other arm, and somehow he put the dog on his head. Seriously, I mean, this is what he said. And there he was in the water, far away from people, and then all of a sudden a passing boat heard him scream, help, help, help. They pulled him out. Verna was dead. Doug was dead. But Fred had survived. And they took him to hospital. They helicoptered him. The guards picked him up and took him to the hospital. And then he discovered that his wife was dead and his stepson was dead.
And where was the dog? On his head?
No. The dog had been pushed onto Bird Rock miraculously. So, you know, I mean, it seems pretty impossible. Wife in one hand, in trouble. Stepson in the other hand, dog on his head. And he got the dog out, and the dog was rescued later.
But what I know about Fred Rayler is that he was an exceptionally strong swimmer. I mean, he was a civilian working with the Navy, but he was a Navy diver and worked in demolitions. So rescuing people was kind of in his blood, wasn't it?
Well, Fred Rayler was very comfortable in ocean water. He lay cables under sea. He knew the ocean back to front. So the fact that this happened seemed to me a terrible tragedy, but I didn't know
So you're agreeing with me that it's a terrible tragedy?
Well, at that time, it wasn't until later that I changed my mind, but we won't get ahead of the story. So we were all in mourning. There was Fred Rayler being taken off the Coast Guard helicopter to the hospital, and then, you know, it was a terrible tragedy. They had died in this terrible accident, and then 3 months later, I picked up the paper, and on the front page, there was a story saying, Fred Rayler arrested for the murder of Werner and Douglas, and the motive for the murder was $700,000 in life insurance. I mean, even that, I still felt it was a terrible tragedy. And don't people take out life insurance for their families? Particularly, Fred was going to sail on his yacht to Mexico, and you never know what could happen in Mexican waters. I don't think so. So it made sense. And then when we heard he was arrested, we said, this is ridiculous. The man, wait a minute. The man's first wife died in a terrible swimming pool accident.
Okay, so let's digress then from this murder, tragedy, whatever it is, that his second wife, Verna, and his stepson, Douglas, died. The dog was saved, just making sure.
Yes.
We'll go back, because I need to understand more about this man that would make you suspicious.
Yeah.
Now, you said earlier that Verna's first husband had died in a tragic accident, and that Fred's first wife had died in a tragic accident.
Yes.
And you said she drowned?
Yes, she drowned in the backyard swimming pool after going into a hot tub.
Okay, so tell me about that.
Well, Jean Rayler, his first wife, was a beautiful airline stewardess with, I think it was United Airlines. And the story we heard was that she came back from a one-day trip to Chicago, got into the pool, took a glass of wine. Fred very heroically went in to change the baby's diapers. And when he came out, there was Jean floating on her face in the swimming pool. Fred pulled her out. Fred gave her dramatic life, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He screamed at the doctor who lived next door to come in and help. And the doctor came in, they took her away, and poor Jean was in the hospital for about 5 days on life support equipment, and finally they decided to pull the plug on Jean. So there was no suspicion of anything with Jean. It's just a terrible tragedy.
I've done my homework, as I always do before I come in and talk to somebody in an interrogation. And there are some other things about that first wife's drowning that I find very interesting. Now, the only marks that she had on her body were 2 bruises on her hips that Fred Rayler said occurred when he pulled her out of the water. Right?
Yes.
And I understand there's a discrepancy between the coroner's scale of the alcohol in her body and the police scale of what alcohol was in her body. Because the coroner said that at most she had 2 sips of wine. Is that right?
Right.
And the detectives investigating that tragedy, the first wife, said she must have been drunk, because on their scale that registered as over the limit for drunk driving even.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct.
So they assumed that she had drowned, being drunk, fallen in and drowned.
Exactly, while Fred was changing the baby's diaper.
Well, let me ask you this. When you pull somebody out of the water, do you do it by their hips?
Well, I don't know.
Do you put your hands under their arms and pull them out?
I don't know. I think you'd ask 50 people, and they get the victim or the drowning person out in any way they could. Okay. So who knew?
But think about it. How do you bend over the pool and grab somebody by their hips and lift them out of the water? Wouldn't that be more consistent with pushing them down into the water?
Well, who knows? But all I can say is Fred said she'd drunk a lot. The alcoholic content of her body was not as much. and then finally, when the life support equipment was taken, they ruled it was an accidental drowning. Fred picked up some life insurance that she had, and that was that. And the whole Malibu neighborhood mourned this passing of a beautiful lady, the mother of 2 young daughters.
So we had a certain amount of sympathy.
Oh, we had terrible sympathy. I mean, after all, there's a guy in the prime of his life who loses a gorgeous wife with 2 young children. I mean, this is it. And so everybody had great sympathy for him. And then, as I mentioned earlier, what happened was, wonders of wonders, he finds another beautiful woman who happens to be a widow, and they marry, and they live happily ever after, but they don't.
So, Verna's first husband, how did he die?
Well, Verna's first husband at the time supposedly was in construction. He was in construction, and he fell off a building in Westwood, in West Los Angeles, and died tragically. That's the story we were given. Later on, we discovered that Verna had not a very happy marriage because her husband was depressing, had a disorder of depression, and he'd actually, I discovered later on, that he jumped off and committed suicide.
Did Fred and Verna know each other at this time?
They knew each other, that they lived in the same neighborhood, and their kids went to the same school, but they didn't start to go out until not long after Jean's death. Very, very shortly after Jean's death, they began going out. But the reason Verna knew all about Fred was, in this small community of Malibu, and I see there's some Malibu people here will attest to that. In the small community of Malibu, the babysitter was the teacher, and everybody knew everybody else's business. So, it was kind of an incestuous relationship. I mean, Fred knew Verna, of course. Verna was a beautiful teacher. Verna babysat Fred's kids. It was pretty intertangled. I mean, it gets confusing, but I won't get confused.
So Fred got some life insurance policy,
Yes.
insurance money, when his first wife died.
Correct.
Right? Verna got money when her husband dies.
Yes.
Okay. I want to dig into this a little bit deeper, this insurance situation. So let's go back. I want you to take me back to Fred's early days. Now, he's in Centerville, Indiana.
Correct.
That's where he lives.
Yes.
And that's where his very supportive family is. And he buys himself a boat, I understand.
Yeah, he buys himself a modest boat, but without jumping ahead of it, and I don't want to do that.
Tell me what happened to the boat.
Well, that boat...
I'm conducting this. I'll decide which information I need you to give me.
Okay, detective. Thank you.
That's my first name, Detective.
Yes, thank you. I remember that.
All right.
Well, what happened was, Fred grew up in Centerville, and his family, believe it or not, had some very unfortunate luck. A boat burned, and they collected insurance.
The family.
The family in Centerville. A car caught fire, and they collected insurance.
This is his family.
His family. This is family. A guest house mysteriously blew up. I mean, was on fire. They collected insurance. So Fred realized that you could collect insurance from menial type of things like boats and cars and guest houses and stuff like that. So again, that was, I didn't get that till later on.
Right, but so what happens to his first boat?
Well, Fred Rayler is in San Francisco when he's dating his first wife, and would you believe the boat blows up? But Fred is able to jump overboard, and he collects insurance on the damaged boat, and he says, well, I think a piece of paper caught in the engine of the boat, and it suddenly exploded. I mean, that was his story.
So he collects the insurance money from
he
that.
collects insurance money on the boat.
And what did he do with that money?
Well, he put it all together because he ended up buying a yacht and quite
So
a
he
large
bought a
yacht.
better boat.
A better boat, yes, a bigger, better boat.
And what happened to that boat?
Well, actually what happened was, we'll tell you about what happened with the boat, but Fred Rayler also was working at Point Magoo, and all of a sudden he was driving along, and he had a speeding car. His car suddenly caught fire, just like that.
And he get insurance money for that?
He did. He got insurance money.
And what did he do with that insurance money?
Well, I think he obviously put it into buying this yacht. So
Didn't he buy a new car also?
Of course, he got a new car with it. Yeah. I mean, I can't remember what kind of car, but he did.
Now I need you to back up here a little bit for me. All right. So he has this first boat, this little rinky-dink boat that burns, and he gets the insurance money from that.
Correct.
Doesn't he buy another boat before the yacht, and that burns, and he gets insurance money from that?
Well, it's a pure coincidence, but I believe he did have two boats. Yeah.
And then I understand that the barn on his property burned down.
Yes.
But the fire started.
Well, the fire started in his next door neighbor's house.
So the next door neighbor's insurance money paid for Fred's barn burning down.
Yeah. It burned down, and Fred was fortunate enough to collect insurance on that. So that's two rather strange circumstances.
Two boats, a barn.
Yes.
And then his car.
Yes.
Okay.
So
I understand there was some real controversy, though, prior to Fred coming out to work at Point Magoo.
Well, there was a lot of controversy because Fred, believe it or not, he was a deep sea diver, and he was in the water with a fellow companion, a fellow diver, and there was a mess up with the diving tanks, the air breathing tanks, and I'm not an expert on water, and tragically this friend of his drowned under the ocean, didn't have enough air.
And they never recovered the body.
No,
or the tanks.
No, the tanks.
So Fred's story was, as I remember it in my investigation of this, that Fred maintained that the Navy photographer who was with them turned his tank off instead of turning it on.
Yeah, I mean, he put the blame on that. But again, one isolated incident does not a suspect make.
But he didn't do real well with authority, and so he gets the job at Point Magoo.
Yes,
He's offered a job as an engineer there.
He gets a job at Point Magoo, and
what does his old boss do when he finds out?
Well, his old boss is not very happy about that because he felt that Fred was utilizing the system, and there were instances at Point. What? No, yeah, you're surprised. Yeah, but I mean, this sounds like a novel, but it isn't. It's true. I mean, but
I'm not convinced yet.
You're not convinced yet.
Yeah.
But even though, I mean, just add them up. I mean, I must tell you one quick thing. Fred Rayler was investigated for the murder of Werner Rayler when a lady friend of the family called up Santa Barbara Sheriff's Office, because Santa Barbara was where the accident took place, and said his first wife died of drowning. Terrible tragedy. His second wife died of drowning. Look into it. And that's what triggered the investigation.
Yeah, but we get current calls like that all the time. What was it about the officer who took that call that made him take it to the detectives?
Well, he just took it to the detectives, and for some reason, when they discovered that Fred's payoff was $700,000 life insurance on Werner and on Douglas, I mean, $60,000 on Douglas, which was worth a lot. Today, that would be about $1.5 million. I don't have the mathematics. So the point was, they thought it was a rather excessive amount of life insurance to take out.
About how much of his yearly salary was Fred paying in insurance premiums?
A lot. I mean, his salary was probably $20,000 a year back then, and obviously it may not have been enough, but he did.
He was paying about 25% if the numbers add up.
Yes, I mean, it didn't make sense, but don't forget there was nobody there at that time to make sense of it. I mean, anybody listening in and watching, we don't know what you have insurance on your kids. We don't know what you have insurance on your home.
So let me just take a break in character here, break the fourth wall. The detectives investigating this case first found out that there was $300,000 insurance that Fred and his wife had on each other and $60,000 on each of their kids. And they went, okay, that's not unusual. But then they found out about the double indemnity clause. And then they found out about another hidden insurance policy that he had. And it was double indemnity on Douglas as well. So now they're beginning to see this is beginning to be a motive for murder.
And that was really the crux of it all. What parent takes out that kind of insurance on a child? Maybe today it would not sound a lot, but yesteryear in the 1980s, early 80s, 70s, it was a hell of a lot of money. And it just stank.
So could we say that if Fred Rayler takes out insurance, he intends to collect on insurance?
I would say that seems to be the case, yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
So we have this first wife who's died under possibly tragic circumstances. We have the new wife who's died with her son under tragic circumstances. One of the things we're starting to look at here is the sociopathic features of somebody. A sociopath goes through life acting out emotions. They watch other people and see their emotions, and they act those out in what they think is an appropriate manner. So Fred knows that he's supposed to be sad if his wife dies. He's not sad, but he acts sad. I have to think that when Fred called the doctor when his first wife was pulled out of the pool, and the doctor comes over and Fred's doing mouth to mouth, they're both naked because they were in the hot tub together in their own house. Fred's trying to rescue her, and the doctor comes over and takes over and gets a pulse. I think at this point Fred Rayler went, I need to go in and change my pants because she's not supposed to be alive. Because if she's alive, she's going to be able to say what I do. But she didn't stay alive for very long.
No, what happened was, and again, one discovers this in retrospect, Fred Rayler's wife was in Los Robles Hospital just down the road for several days on life support equipment. And I remember this because his mother came in from Indiana, and the father, and finally, and the suffering parents of the first wife, the Schoenhovens, that was their name. And the mother of Fred Rayler says to the Schoenhovens, this has got to end. My Fred is suffering too much. And what they do is they get an agreement to pull the plug on Gene. And, one wonders.
Hadn't Fred already donated her organs by that point?
Well, by that time, he made a point of saying, when we pull the plug, her organs are going to be given to wherever exactly. Yes.
So what you're telling me is this is really a case of 20/20 hindsight.
Well, of course.
So, but when Fred is arrested, you and Sally, your first wife, your late wife Sally, who I understand assisted you with, she was a BBC presenter and a magazine writer, investigative reporter, and both she and you took this investigation, and your intent was what?
Well, of course, I felt the guy was innocent. He was like Job. He all this bad, awful luck had hit him. And so we decided that he was innocent. And when he got arrested, we couldn't believe it. So we finally went to the trial.
You sat through the trial.
Sat through every day of the trial. And we thought the district attorney was a pain in the you-know-where, and because he was going after this innocent guy. And then after about 9 months of trial in the city of Santa Barbara Courthouse, because, as I might have mentioned, Santa Cruz Island falls within the jurisdiction of Santa Barbara County. So the trial was in Santa Barbara. We went there every day of the trial. We sat with his parents. We heard the evidence, and it was very technical. It was so technical about bruising. Was there bruising? Wasn't there bruising? And one interesting thing we discovered was that, believe it or not, the bodies of Verna and Douglas had been sent to the Westwood mortuary, and just as the cops were starting to investigate, they called up the crematorium and said, we need to see those bodies. And the crematorium said, we're backed up for a week. You're lucky, because they would have been.
Well, they said they were cremated, and then they made them go check.
They checked, and they discovered they were not cremated. Then the cops were able to get the bodies and do their examinations, which goes into, was there bruising on their head? Was there not bruising? That was a whole technical thing that I really was not an expert on. So they were very lucky to get the bodies from the mortuary before they were cremated.
So you and Sally are beginning your own investigation into Fred to prove that he's innocent.
We believe he was innocent. We went to see him at the stinking Folsom prison, which is, I mean, every prison is pretty stinking, but Folsom is pretty bad. Anybody ever been in Folsom prison as an inmate?
Oh.
Anyway, so we go and see him, and because we believed this guy was innocent. We believed that he was a man wrongly accused. And so we began our investigation by visiting him in jail, and he told us his story. We knew him. We thought we knew him. And I must say that we, even after watching the trial for 9 months, we thought there wasn't enough evidence. And when he was convicted of the murders, too much.
We know, it's public record.
Yes, public record, yeah.
Okay.
Did I forget that I said he was convicted?
It's kind of like the judge says, forget what you've just heard.
Yeah. Yes.
Tear that out of your notebooks, jury.
Yes. So where were we now?
So you and Sally are investigating, and
Yeah.
you're beginning to find out now about the first wife and the insurance frauds, and when the Malibu fires occur, and there's mudslides in Malibu, and Fred decides that he's going to build a retaining wall
Yes.
using rock cages.
Yes.
And everybody thinks he's a wonderful guy doing that, except for his next door neighbor, who doesn't like the looks of it. So tell me what happened with the next door neighbor.
Well, the next door neighbor sues Fred, and Fred sues him, and they get into a battle, and Fred wins another insurance claim against the next door neighbor. So there's a little pattern building up. But don't forget, detective, don't forget, we didn't have the big picture.
Okay. Well, what happened to the neighbor's house? Any guesses?
Well, actually, I seem to recall that there was a mysterious fire.
Started by a homeless person.
Probably. Yeah.
And Fred was over there with his hose trying to put it out, but was a
yeah.
little too late.
It was too late to do that, yeah. So there was another, I mean, explaining it now, detective, it seems like it...
Do you feel a little foolish at this point?
Not at the time.
Not at the time. At some point, you and Sally had to look at each other and go, holy cow, he's guilty. When did that occur?
Well, it's kind of the aha moment. We were in Richmond, Indiana. We went to Richmond, Indiana to research Fred Rayler's life. Fred Rayler gave us people to talk to. He told us some schoolmates and some girlfriends and stuff. And when we went back there, nobody wanted to talk to us. They said no.
Why?
Well, because they said you are private investigators trying to get Fred
Off.
Yes. And it was amazing.
But everybody loved Fred.
Well, it seemed like it, except when we gave the people in Indiana an opportunity to talk to us, saying we would not quote them. And they all did talk to us, and they told us a very different story about the family. And there was one crucial line they said, again, which you mentioned, if the insurance is involved, the railers get paid off.
Now, you also went so far as to take a dinghy out to Santa Cruz Island.
I did, because I wanted to see if indeed the boat overturned, why couldn't Fred save them by getting onto the rock? And I'm not a great swimmer, so I got out in the water, I swam to where it happened, and I saw that you could actually...
With a dog on your head.
Well, no, I didn't have a dog,
okay.
yeah.
Just
no.
checking.
No, I skipped the dog, I just swam, and I thought, it was fairly... it could happen. I was astonished that you could push somebody onto the rock. So when I went to see Fred, I said I went to...
So you discovered that it was possible to save somebody by pushing them up on the rock.
Yes, I did. And as I say, I didn't have one in one hand, the other hand, one and a dog on my head. No. I mean, but it looked as though you could have done it.
Could you get back in the boat?
Well, I was able to get back in the boat, yes. And then when I went to see Fred at Folsom Prison, I said, it didn't look so bad to me to get somebody on the rock. And Fred said, where did you leave from? And I said, well, we left from Santa Barbara. He said, no, it's a whole different thing when you get to the rock and you leave from Ventura. And I thought, what a bunch of old baloney is this? And then by that time, I was getting very antsy.
Now, Fred's loving mother, who is always concerned about her little boy, she made some demands of you when you and Sally went back.
Well, there's one story. After we went to see Fred's parents, and Fred had made a magnificent mural in the prison workshop, which we carried like a 6-foot mural onto the plane to give to his mother. After we spoke to the neighbors and the friends and the schoolmates, the mother, Charlotte, invited Sally and I to the house as we were about to leave. And she said, I have a question to ask you. She poured us a glass of a homemade elderberry wine and said, you'll enjoy this. She said, is there going to be any skeletons in the cupboard with what you've discovered? Well, I said, every family has skeletons. And I want to tell you that at that moment, and Sally looked at me and I looked at Sally and we thought, this sounds like a horror film, doesn't it? I thought, as we drank the homemade elderberry wine, it's a true story. And I just thought, my God, we know the secrets of the family. Are we going to get out of here alive? And we did.
Because you didn't have any insurance on you.
No. Yes. There you go.
So you're beginning now to see a whole different side to Fred. And you're seeing that he doesn't react the way normal people do in situations. And the machinations of the trial that went on, and honestly, the book details it extremely well. It's incredibly readable. I was literally couldn't put the book down. Del says, dinner time. Oh, okay, just a minute. pages. Because it was fascinating, all of the intricacies that went into a 9-month trial, and then the sentencing afterwards. But now, when all that is done, now you're starting this investigation. You're going and visiting Fred still, right?
I'm still visiting Fred.
And as you're giving him this information, as you're asking him questions about this, what is he saying?
Well, he says, I said, some of the people we interviewed from school and your background weren't all flattering. He said, I would like you to give me transcripts of every interview, who said what. And I said, Fred, you know, we promised that if they spoke to us honestly and genuinely, we would not reveal who they were. And he said, well, that means this is the end of our relationship. And from then on, we were in prison at the time, visiting him. We left the jail and never went back to see him. And I've never had any personal communication with Fred since that day.
And what Ivor did there was a real good interrogator trick. When he says they were not very flattering. He didn't say they called you a, right? They're not very flattering. It's like I would never say to somebody, you're a liar, because that closes down all communication. But I will say, I don't think you're being entirely truthful with me. What did I just do? I just called him a liar, but there's some wiggle room in that. So that was a very good approach.
Yeah.
You can have my job.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, but no thanks. So here we have...
Let's talk about this.
Changing. So this is Bill Fairfield. Some of you in the audience may remember Bill Fairfield. He was a brilliant lawyer, and he was one of the best friends of Fred Rayler. And the reason... Bill, during the trial, fell on his sword for his friend. He said, I was the guy who told Fred to get this life insurance. I said to Fred, you're going on a long voyage on the new yacht. You need to cover yourself. And I don't think it quite happened that way, but Bill took the rap. And the other interesting thing is, which I think is fascinating, is that Bill Fairfield was such a good lawyer and friend of Fred that he was able to get the insurance company, and I don't know if you've ever dealt with insurance companies, to pay off every single penny of life insurance before the trial was over, before the guilty verdict came in. So that was quite amazing.
So let me explain a little bit about Bill Fairfield's role in all of this. Fred Rayler is what we would call a malignant narcissist. He's not just a narcissist, he's a malignant narcissist, which basically means if you challenge him, he's going to come after you, right? And one of the keys with malignant narcissists is they have what they call flying monkeys. And these are people that they have convinced that they're in the right and you're in the wrong. And those people will approach you on the street and berate you just out of the blue because they really believe what the malignant narcissist has told them. Bill Fairfield was the biggest flying monkey of them all because he took everything that Rayler said as gospel and would defend him to the end. I want to read something here that will give you a kind of an idea about Fred Rayler. So Fred's in jail waiting trial. And he comes up with a list of 38 things that were all enumerated about why he wouldn't have killed his second wife, Verna, and his stepson, Douglas. Now, you have to understand that this was kind of a training outing before the family was supposed to go on a cruise to Mexico. So this is a man who, if this is indeed a terrible tragedy, should be incredibly broken up, right? It's awful. He said, there's a few here. I would not want to subject the other 3 children to the loss of Douglas and Verna. I would not have wanted to subject the other 3 children to my being jailed. Would certainly not have drowned them, as it would look very suspicious having lost Jean in the pool. Could have waited for the trip to Mexico and lost them both offshore with no one around. Could have waited till we were in Mexico and then have them, quote unquote, done in by bandits. Would not have recovered bodies. The ocean's a big place and deep. Very little effort to have them not wash up on shore. Would have beat them up on the rocks to mask anything I would have done. Could have cut them up and had sharks in 10 minutes. So this is Fred Rayler thinking about what I should have done as opposed to what I did. If I had this to do over, if I had a mulligan on the murder, this is the way I would have done it. But he's using this to try to convince people that these were good reasons why he wouldn't be the murderer. Now, having read these reasons, what do you think? All right, so
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, the fact that he wrote that down, I mean, I'm sure there's a few psychologists and psychiatrists in the audience, and maybe we'll get to that in the Q&A, but it sounds a weird thing. I mean, Fred Rayler wrote to me, wrote to all his friends, and the thing I remember about seeing all those letters was the fact that each letter seemed to be written by a different person. I mean, if you like fishing, he wrote to you about fishing. If you were into religion, he wrote to you about religion. He knew I like soccer, so he said something about soccer. So this was a man who wrote 10 different people with a letter that sounded like it was coming from a different personality. I'm not a shrink. So here's the picture of my son Gideon and young Douglas, right, second from the right at the end, third from the right at the end. Oh no, sorry, forget that. Start again. It's a long time ago.
get your story straight, sir.
1978. Sorry, I'm. Douglas is second on the left, and Fred is, you can see, a big guy, quite hefty, and there's a scrawny me and my son Gideon, who is here tonight. He remembers the soccer team very well. Anyway, so sorry, we got back to the picture, so. Yeah.
One thing that we'll mention before we go to the Q&A that kind of fits in with all of this is Fred Rayler, working out at Point Mugu, wants some time off, and he doesn't get it. So he has a slip and fall with a computer in the office. And he is off work for 18 months. And Point Mugu says, "You're a civilian. We're going to fire you." And he goes, "Okay." And the day he's told that he's going to be fired is when he goes out and buys a 50-foot yacht.
Yes.
Because he knows when this goes to a hearing, Fred Rayler kept notes on every conversation, everything, an incident that happened. Good old Bill goes fired up into the hearing against two civilian, not even lawyers, just employment people, and blows them out of the water. So Fred gets reinstated, he gets 2 years worth of back pay, and he's now untouchable. Because if they go after him again, it's going to be harassment. He knew he was going to win that case.
He knew how to use the system. He learned, he was a meticulous note taker. He knew how to, he had more detail than the insurance companies, and whenever he fought an insurance claim, he had more detail than the insurance claim said, "Pay him, let's get him off our backs." And, with one thing, as I say, we're almost out for Q&A.
Yeah, we got it.
We didn't even look at all the pictures. Because it's been...
You're a very difficult person to interrogate.
I don't know where I was, so I think...
I'm ready to confess.
Thank you. Okay, Detective. Ready for some questions?
Show the picture of Fred at the end.
Okay, can we go another picture?
Oh, yeah, sorry about that, yeah.
Another picture? Okay,
So this is Sally and I visiting Fred in Folsom Prison. It looks as though it looks quite lavish, but... And the young guy on the right is me, believe it or not. Sally and Fred.
Where'd you get those glasses?
Oh.
All right, so these are the two detectives that investigated the case.
These are the two detectives who did a terrific job in not being fooled by Fred, and they actually got a...
Okay, next. Okay, so that's Fred when he was arrested. Next.
Yeah, he's a pretty rugged-looking guy.
That's the defense attorney.
Jim Farley.
Many of you may remember Jim Farley. He was a big showman, defense attorney.
Terrific guy.
One more. Okay, in
There's
court.
Fred, very dapperly dressed, going to court with his briefcase and his whole thing. He looks very elegant.
And one more. There's Fred today.
There's Fred there.
79 years old, still in prison, despite the efforts of his three daughters to get him freed. I think 3 governors have turned him down.
Yeah.
And so it does, and now they're trying to get him out on compassionate leave because he's got health problems and all that kind of stuff. And if he gets out, I think Ivor's going to leave the country. Or make sure he doesn't have any insurance.
Yeah, well, I must add, before we take a question, thank you. I should mention that Fred Rayler has been writing to me in the last 6 months, okay? Now, Fred Rayler says to me, "Dear Ivor, I'd like to read your book because I want to make sure it's, number one, unbiased, and number two, it is factually correct." Here is a convicted murderer who wants to make sure my book is factually correct. So,
He was on his way to the post office, and I said, "Don't do it. Don't send that book."
well, no, that's true. I mean, the point is that he's got nothing else to do than go to the law library. And I'm sure that, I mean, the interesting thing is, I'm sure when this interview goes onto the internet, Fred Rayler will watch it, you know, and I'm going to hear more from him. So it's an interesting, fascinating, bizarre set of circumstances.
If he calls me, I'm just going to throw you under the bus, okay?
Thank you.
Ivor, I'm ready with the microphone for Q&A. Would you like to do the selection, folks? David?
Thank you, Friday. Sure. Do you have the phone number for the insurance company? I'd like to take out a policy. No. My question is, this occurred over 40 years ago. Why has it taken this long for this to come forward?
Well, the interesting thing is that, believe it or not, Sally and I wrote the book 40 years ago. It was accepted by a publisher. And then, at the same time as it was accepted by a publisher, there was a big case about Green Beret Captain Jeffrey McDonald, who killed his family. I don't know if you remember the case. And McGinnis, I forget the writer's first name, Joe McGinnis. Joe McGinnis wrote a terrific book on the McDonald case because McDonald hired him to write the book. So it went to court. McDonald sued McGinnis. And after 6 months in the federal court in downtown LA, it was a hung jury. And my publisher at the time had the heebie-jeebies. He actually said to me, "Do you have E&O insurance?" Well, seriously, E&O insurance. I didn't. And so they, errors and omissions, which you take for business. And then because of what happened with McGinnis, the same time, the big publishing house chickened out. So now we have the new book, which I've cut down by 40,000 words. It's difficult, believe it or not. It's still pretty, 300 pages. And I'm doing it because I must say, I mean, it was a brilliant book. Sally wrote all the best parts, because if you look at the book, you will see the brilliant direction she did. I mean, Sally could interview somebody, and she did. She could sit and do an interview with you for 45 minutes. She wouldn't take a single note, because the person being interviewed thought, well, she can't be paying attention, and they would say all sorts of things. And she was able to go back to the office and had a photographic memory to get it all down. And then she described the women, so she described the women, what they were wearing. I'm terrible. I would just say, you know, you're wearing a dress, and that would be it. Pink dress. And
So Sally's technique, no notes, all right? I don't take any notes in an interrogation room at all, because I can't write as fast as they talk, and it's very intimidating. If I write something down, they go, "Oh, what did I just say?" You know, my partner, who's watching this through in the audiovisual room, she's the one taking all the notes, right? And
or recording it.
well, they are recording it, but she's also taking the notes,
Yeah.
because she needs to know, did I miss this or did I miss that, because she's my backup for this. So at some point during the interrogation, I take a literal break and I leave the room and go and talk to her about that stuff, and then we go back in. So that's a brilliant technique on Sally's part.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because it puts the person being interviewed relaxed. You can't be writing it down. I can say anything. I mean, that's not the way it works. So, Go ahead. Is there any other
Excellent.
questions? or
Other
can we go home?
questions?
Go ahead, Bob.
Hi, Ivor. You're a brilliant storyteller today, as you've always been. When the trial got to the verdict stage and the jury came back with guilty, at that point, how surprised were you and Sally?
We were absolutely stunned when he was found guilty because we didn't think there was sufficient. And don't forget, we were brainwashed, really. We were in his camp, and we thought, well, my God, what happened? But thinking back to that, Fred was such an ego guy that he insisted on testifying himself. And he was very cold and very calculated. And even during the penalty phase, because they were going to sentence him to death, and they gave him life without parole, even he showed the wedding film to the jury in the hopes they would not send him to the gas chamber. And then, of course, the gas chamber was abandoned, and he got life without possibility of parole, and that's where he's been since then. So I think, Bob, if I answer your question completely, or did I miss something out?
You were shocked. You and Sally were shocked.
Yeah, we were shocked. Yeah, we were shocked, and that's when he was found guilty. That's when I said to Fred, he knew I wanted to write a book about him, and Sally wanted to write a book about him, and he said, "Don't write a book because I'm going to be found innocent." And now he said, "I've got nothing to lose. Write your book." And so we were off and running, and that was. And the jury I spoke to later said he was cold. He was, he suddenly broke into tears on par. And again, I wasn't a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but I don't know. I mean, did you ever have somebody who broke into tears?
All the time, right? So the way you can tell the difference between real tears and false tears is with real tears, they're snot. Seriously, right? I mean, you can probably, there's quite a number of people in the audience who could probably give me some crocodile tears right now, but you can't give me snot that goes along with it. So a quick little story with that. When Susan Smith, who was a lady that said she was carjacked and her kid, the car was driven into a lake and the kids drowned, but before they found the car, she's doing a press conference, and there's all the detectives lined up behind her, and I was visiting my dear sainted mother, and she said, "Oh, that poor woman, that poor woman." I said, "Mom, you see all those detectives that are behind her? Not one of them believes a word she's saying." "Oh, you're so cynical. This job's just ruined you." And then, of course, when they found out that she did drown her kids, she was even more mad at me for being right? But she's standing out there, "I just want my kids," but there's no snot. No snot.
Do we have another question? I was hoping for this side of the room. I feel like we're heavily weighted over here. Here we go. Here we go.
Hello.
Hello.
I want to say I've known Ivor since 1983. My husband was his assistant soccer coach. I'm just saying. Just saying.
Yeah.
Our son and Gideon were on the same soccer team, and just as an aside, Ivor was a fantastic soccer coach, and they went to the playoffs. So, what I wanted to ask you about was, and you explained a little bit about the collaboration that you and Sally had with this book.
Yeah.
And specifically, of the two of you, who was the first one that cracked? Who was the first one that said,
Well, yeah, I mean, we slightly touched upon that, but you talked about the aha moment, and the aha moment came when we were back in Southern California, and I suddenly, as you pointed out during your interrogation, a car burned, a barn burned, a boat burned, and there was a pattern, and I remember sitting there thinking 5 different claims that his parents, his father did, they were all repeated. And I want to tell you, at that moment, it doesn't happen very often, but the hairs on the back of my neck started tingling. And I realized he's guilty. He's guilty. I mean, I think today, and I'm sorry to take this further, today if you spoke to Fred Rayler, I mean, I'm going to throw the question to you. Does Fred Rayler think he's guilty?
Not a chance. He's a poor, hard, done-by guy.
Okay.
I mean, he knows on one level that he's guilty, but he will convince himself that he's not. He is not somebody that would ever confess to something like this. And I think our DAs and DA investigator that are with us will attest to cases where the jury disregards the evidence and just goes on what their gut feels. And their gut here said, this guy's guilty.
Ivor, this is a question for you and the investigator. I'd be curious as to what the two of you, how you would explain that Fred Rayler's living children all think he's innocent.
Well, that's a very good question, because they do. And this is another tragedy, because and then I'll give you a chance, but if the girls admitted today that they're middle-aged, if they admitted today that their dad was guilty, or he admitted to them, then they would realize that their life over the last 40 to 50 years has been a lie. And I don't think people could live with that. Psychologically, what do you think?
Oh, I agree. And the daughters are very good examples of flying monkeys at this point. They have nowhere to go. They have to remain convinced, or as Ivor says, they just live the lie. So this has become part of their life. It's important to them. This belief is important to them. And they will go out and tell anybody who's willing to listen that their dad is innocent. Get something else over there.
And that is such a, I feel for the kids. Douglas is Gideon's age. Would have been.
Let's fight over this, shall we?
Yeah.
Thank you both for your performances this evening. Let me ask you if there are any parallels between the Manson books that you wrote and this one, other than they both share a psychopathic diagnosis.
I would say absolutely not. I mean, Manson was a total, a lunatic, really. But on the other hand, I'm sorry, I've just changed my mind, because Manson claimed he was not guilty of any of the killings. Manson said, I didn't kill them, I just sent them out, and then what they did, they did. So Manson was able to convince himself until his death a couple of years ago that he didn't do the murders. I mean, later on there were other murders that Manson did that he was personally involved in, but we won't go into those now. So psychologically there may be, I mean, Manson is probably one of the worst mass murderers of the last century. I mean, so there is a similarity, but there isn't. They're both shrewd, they're both conniving, they know how to manipulate people. Okay, maybe you're right. Sorry, go ahead.
And I think in one way, as Ivor says, Manson's a lunatic, right? His motives for doing those murders are completely different than Fred's motives for doing the murders. Fred's motives for doing the murders was Fred, right? Gain. And Manson really wasn't from that position. But you can see the sociopathic personality, psychopathic personalities in both of them. They just manifest in different ways.
Got a lot of questions.
Ivor, you mentioned that you had to cut some 40,000 words out of your original manuscript from the 80s. Are there 2 or 3 key things that you cut that you would very much like to have included had you had the room to put it in the book?
Well, it's very hard to cut a book down by 40,000 words. And when the publisher said do that, I had to do a lot of rearranging of the furniture. I mean, there was a lot more testimony, which quite frankly, bruising testimony about whether it was a bruise, the size of a bruise, it's going to put you to sleep, and it put the jury to sleep. And when you have the expert, one expert says this, one expert says that, so that was easy to cut. But what wasn't easy to cut was a lot of the background with some of the people I spoke to in Indiana about Fred, but it was sort of repetitive. It's just bloody hard work because, you know, you spent a lot of time writing the book and you end up, you know, using a machete on your words. And I mean, any writers in the room will probably agree with me, and you know this, Paul. Paul's a writer, of course, and very successful. Is it hard to cut a book?
Well, we say you have to kill your darlings. Kill your babies. Right? There's parts of a book that you just love and you really want it in there, but it really just doesn't belong and needs to be cut out. I think Gideon had a question about why you let a psychopath coach his soccer team.
Well, I'll tell you. Well, let me tell you. This is a weird story.
We haven't had any weirdness at this point.
So when I was friendly with Fred Rayler, I took Gideon as a child to see him in the prison. And we were sitting in the exercise yard, and don't forget, Douglas was the same age as Gideon, in the same soccer team. And Fred Rayler starts to massage Gideon's neck. And Gideon was pained because he did it too hard. It actually hurt him. Do I lie?
So I'm still going through therapy from that session, but my parents never realized that you probably shouldn't bring a 10-year-old to Folsom Prison. That's a whole nother story.
Do
You want to continue?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say a couple things. One comment, one was a comment and one was a question. The comment was, for those of you who have been following the news, when you read the passage about Fred and the ways that if he had done it, he would have done it, reminded me of somebody recent in the news, O.J. Simpson, I think did exactly the same thing. So I don't know the law enforcement people here if it qualifies under the same sociopath or narcissist, but I thought that was eerily familiar. But I did have a question, actually. First of all, I've known Ivor since 1972, for the record, so take that, Diane. Verna's family, I know we talked about the daughters, Kirsten and Heidi, who were Fred's biological kids, but Kim, who was Verna's biological daughter and Doug's full sister, did she come out in support of Fred? And what about Verna's other family? Did they support Fred, and at one point did they change their tune?
Well, the answer was that, I mean, the mother of Verna was a very old lady at the time, and Fred had given her a place to live, and she wasn't going to blow that up. But, and you mentioned one of the kids. Don't forget, the surviving girls, having both lost mothers, I mean, they obviously unified. And I remember, I won't mention who this said to me, that a member of my family knew one of the daughters, didn't say she knew me, and the daughter said, my mother, Verna, died of breast cancer, which I guess is an easier way to say it. And so, I mean, the pain of thinking that they would have to admit that their father was a terrible man is impossible to live with.
And of course, after Fred's first wife drowned, Fred would tell everybody that she died of an aneurysm. So we see the denial process going through with all of this.
Hi, and this is pure speculation, but if he had the what do you think he wants right now? If he had the opportunity to go on camera and give an interview, do you think he would take it? And can you speculate what he might say?
Well, I'll just, I'll pass it to you. No, please. Fred Rayler was involved in a podcast a few years ago. He was on the podcast, and he spoke frankly to the podcaster. I think he used that in the hopes that it would get him parole. It didn't work. So what do you think?
Oh, there's no doubt Fred's a narcissist. He's going to go on camera. Right, he's going to go on camera, and he's going to proclaim his innocence for all the world. He's going to vilify Anybody who is against him is going to, again, vilify the district attorneys at the time, the police at the time, Ivor, probably me at this point, because he has to live that passage, that through line, that narrative. That's his narrative. One of the things that people don't, nobody's the villain in their own narrative, in their own mind. He's not the villain in his mind. And as an interrogator, that's one of the things we have to really understand. This person sitting in front of you is not a villain in their mind. All right? So I think he'd jump at the chance, and we hope it doesn't occur.
We've got time for 2 more questions. I'm going to come back over to this side. Thank you.
Thank you both so very much. I wanted to talk a little about narcissism, because when you're around a narcissist and you're surviving, whether you're a child or a spouse, you have to play a very interesting role of denying what's reality, because their reality is the only reality. So I'm wondering, how did you, Ivor, and all the people that knew Fred not pick up on all the red flags?
But don't forget that we didn't start putting the pieces together until much later. I noticed in the back of the audience, and I don't want to put them on the spot, but he will anyway. I'm going to, yes. There is a lawyer in town, I just saw you, called Mike Velthone, who is very familiar with this story. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Mike, but would you like to have a crack at this, or because you're a lawyer, a prominent lawyer in town, you want to stay off it? Mike? No. Okay.
Yeah, I think this is a case of 20/20 hindsight, right? Nobody's going to see the red flags one at a time because they're occurring all over the place. And until you start to follow the trail backward, you don't really see that. But your take on narcissism is absolutely 100% right. Theirs is the only story that counts. And anything that strays from that, they're going to squash.
Just for context, the night after when this occurred, Fred came home with my... Sure. The night after this accident, when it occurred, my family, my mom and dad and I went to the hospital, and we took Fred home. He rode in the back seat. They were good friends with my parents. My parents are still good friends with the Fairfields. I will just make a couple. I remember Fred. I don't have a strong recollection. I was a young kid. I know I look old, but I'm not that old. It's easy in hindsight. I would say that one good question to ask is, what if he didn't do it? Right? I think it was a legitimate question, and there's still people that believe he didn't do it. People who are removed, objective, who sat through the trial, who listened to the evidence, one of whom happens to be my law partner. So I don't think this is quite, it's easy to sort of look at circumstances from a lens. This is not to express my own opinion on the subject, which I will keep to myself, but I just want to make that observation.
Well, without putting you on the spot, Mike, somebody you know thinks it was an injustice, but did this somebody you know sit through the trial from beginning, from day one, and see Fred testifying?
Yes.
They did?
Yes.
The whole trial?
Whole trial, every day.
Well, why would you have, I don't want to, sorry, why would you have an appeals court lawyer sitting in the trial from day one? Doesn't make sense.
Well, I don't want to get into the legal issues of it, but I will just say that, one thing that you didn't get into, and I'm familiar with the story only secondhand, but the physical evidence of the murder, of the crime itself, was, I would say, pretty thin. So thin that a court of appeal almost reversed the conviction for lack of evidence. It was a 2-to-1 on a habeas in the Ninth Circuit. We actually won just to say there isn't enough evidence to convict this man. So one of the interesting aspects of this particular case is it's not a case of a bloody hatchet, a gun, or anything like that. It is a circumstantial case. with a lot of conflicting. One thing you didn't mention is that the original coroner, the Ventura County coroner, did not ruled it an accidental drowning. Said nothing here. So it is a complicated case with, as you say, as you learn lots of things about the situation, I can see how you can look at it the way that you do. And it's not to say I don't disagree. I disagree with you. I'll keep my views to myself. But I think it is a very complicated and very interesting situation.
And I think that's what makes this book such a fascinating read. That you really need to read this and find out in your own mind what you think of this case. Was this a sociopathic killer on a rampage, or was this a poor guy that just a victim of circumstance? And if you don't buy the book, I will interrogate you about why. I think we got one more. Are we done?
I think we are at that point because we want to provide some opportunities. Oh, Gideon gets to talk.
I usually don't talk, but I do want to recognize one person. Yeah. So this manuscript sat on the shelf for 40 years, right? Yeah. Sorry. And if you've read his other books, you'll realize that this book is a lot better because of my mom. So it's a huge testament to my mom. But I want to thank Clark Hubbard right here in the front, because Clark actually took the manuscript. If you know my dad, he's not the most organized guy. I think the only copy that was left of this manuscript was a printed, binded copy, bound, I think is the word, sorry. Clark Hubbard painstakingly took this and scanned every single page, and that's one of the main reasons why this book is now published. So Clark, thank you.
I want to say thank you to Ivor, to Paul, to Gideon, to Sally, and to all of you. I really appreciate the conversation at the end. One of the things the museum tries to point out is that life is not simple. Life is not, either or. Life is and but. And we really appreciate having had this opportunity. And I will say, the book really is, as you said, a great read. I also was like, honey, wait for dinner. So there are copies over here for sale. Ivor, you are going to be there and able to answer any other questions. And thank you, all of you, for being here.